This is Irene Tsakrelia. I'm the director of the educational programming at the Stephen Myron Hall Foundation, and it is a great pleasure to welcome Anne Lindberg to our lecture series under the bigger umbrella theme Resonance. This year, we have our residents on the panel as well, who are doing the architecture residency program, which is an annual program happening every July, an intensive architecture dive, and all the residents are doing some excellent work so far. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you, Anne, and I will pass it on to Jackie to introduce you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really excited to introduce Anne today. As a visual artist myself, I'm always interested in how artists are working and responding to architecture. Anne Lindberg is a New York-based artist whose drawings and thread installations explore the sensory and emotional resonance of space, light, and movement. Known for her drawings in space, Lindberg uses thousands of chromatic cotton threads stretched in varying densities to form luminous, site-specific works that engage both architecture and the body. Anne writes, each mark, color, or line is simultaneously an action and a response, a moment, a thought, a leap of faith, and a record of that leap. It feels timely to work with ideas of the indeterminate, the immaterial, the mysterious, and the unknown. Color sits at the forefront of my work, where it has the power to elicit visceral responses to the profound and disquieting presence in which we all live. Anne is a recipient of the Joan Mitchell Foundation grant. Her work is held in major U.S. collections, including Everson Museum of Art, Arkansas Museum of Fine Art, Akron Art Museum, Detroit Institute of Art, Kemper Museum of Contemporary Art. The list goes on. I'll give it to you, Anne. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I need to share my screen. So I will do that and open the PowerPoint. Can you see that?
Yep,
Yes.
looks great.
Okay, so where are my notes? I guess I have to use my paper ones that I printed, thankfully. So hello, everyone. I understand that it may not be morning where everyone is, but good morning. I'm not sure where everyone's coming from. A few from near where I live. I'm actually about 20-25 minutes from Rhinebeck, so within the community of T-Space, to the east a little bit. So thank you for the opportunity, all the folks at T-Space and Archive Gallery for inviting me to give this talk. And also, as I think some of you may know, I'm gearing up to install a collaborative exhibition with a poet in early September. It opens the reception on Saturday and then open to the public on Sunday right before Labor Day, so Sunday, September 6th. And I'm working with poet H.L. Hicks, and I will end the talk with some images, some renderings that I'm excited about of the project, so to give you a little teaser of what it may look like. So the following few images will show you some early influential experiences, not this, of course, but some sort of core conceptual grounding or resonances that are, sort of key to the most basic concepts of my work. And these are touchstones that I continue to refer to. So the first is the body in space. And what a more perfect image to express this notion than this 72 piece by Rebecca Horn. So this person is standing and has a 20-foot, maybe 24-foot, I'm not sure exactly, probably a 20-foot 2x4 strapped to their head. And obviously there's a line from the camera under his feet away from us. So there's 2 dimensions implied there, and then obviously the 4th dimension. But what I find particularly provocative about this image, first of all, I'd love to do that someday, is the fact that look how far the 2x4 tilts with the slightest gesture of his head. It really doesn't take much for the exponential movement of that line to totally change its relationship to the ground plane, to the body, and to the environment that this person is standing in. So it's like a microscope illuminating the slight tilt of the head. And it's apparently so simple, but really it's not simple at all. It's quite profound in my work, in my understanding. So I'm interested in how the body my work sort of greets the body first and in a sort of primal physiological way. And then eventually the intellect and analysis and language come later. So our bodies are indeed messengers. So the second touchstone is textiles. I do have an MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art where I was in the fiber department, although I worked with everything but fibrous materials, which is the way there. So some early experiences I had, you're looking at two quite old Japanese indigo dyed textiles that would have been for kimono, and then below are two images in nature. One is the side of a horse in a black and white photograph of the sort of freckles of the horse and flocking birds along Squaw Creek, along the Missouri River. I used to live in Kansas City. So there's a deep influence in textiles and phenomenological conditions in nature and animal life that influenced my work. My early work was in printmaking, eventually textiles, mark making, and pattern. So I've combined all of these interests. What's particularly beautiful to me about the textiles that I'm sharing is they're indigo dyed for one, and indigo has an extraordinary ability to render the long range, I'll call it the long range of tone between white and the deepest indigo, nearly black, and the subtlety that can be achieved. These are both clamp or stitch dyed, so it's resistance that creates the pattern and traps the oxygen from greeting the cloth. So indigo has been an important process, color, cultural condition, agricultural space that's been a part of my life for a very long time. Here I am in the 1980s in Japan working with a traditional indigo dyer. Indigo is really the oldest dye for cloth. I mean, I guess you could say human blood and oil would be sort of like red, yellow, blue in a way, one could say. So I'm fascinated by the mythologies around indigo. You can see the dye pot we're looking at there. That's a traditional ceramic dye pot that, in this case, I think is being heated a little bit. You can see the wire coming off of it, but there's a slick that forms on the top of the dye pot that's sort of you want to keep healthy. You're keeping oxygen out of the dye pot, and then when the cloth is submerged in the dye and lifted into oxygen, it slowly turns blue. It's a kind of mythological notion, sort of magical situation. Indigo is a plant not unlike mint in its scale and look. It grows around the middle of the globe in all of the continents. So in undergrad and grad school, I worked almost exclusively with indigo and actually had the opportunity then to intern at the Smithsonian with a collection of West African textiles that were primarily indigo dyed. So a couple other touchstones or elements that resonate with me are color as a reflection of place and the idea of gradient and perception. So indigo, the color of indigo in Japan, which, whoops, I have this mislabeled. I apologize. That says Tuareg chief, but that's not a Tuareg chief. That's a Japanese clamp dyed textile. So the indigo in Japan is actually a slightly different blue than the indigo in India or in Mexico or in parts of Asia. So to me, color is a reflection of place, in this case, due to the fact that it's a plant material, but color also can be an indication of place. And then this whole notion of gradient and perception. Via Selmans, the Latvian painter wizard, as far as I'm concerned, uses subjects like webs, water. She's drawn replicas of guns, rocks, envelopes. She's sort of interested in this place where something that's hyper perceptual slips into abstraction. It's almost so real that it feels abstract, or so abstract that it feels real. It's this kind of teeter-totter space that I think is quite interesting. The slow tonal accumulation. This is a mezzotint, which is made by rocking a metal blade across a surface to achieve tone. So the slow, slippery, silvery, magical quality. And line to me is rooted in the language of drawing. So then these two extraordinary women knew each other in the 1950s, Lenore Tawney and Agnes Martin. There's the famous photograph of them on the roof at Quanti Slip. Tawny is really important to me as a person who broke open the structure of weaving and understood it as a form of drawing, where the threads could freely move within the warp, in this case, which is vertical. The weft is finding its way in all sorts of twists and turns. That really was a revolutionary notion, and her work is quite emotional and tender, and it's very often informed by ideas of water. And then there's Agnes Martin. Look at her. She had a singular focus. She left New York to eventually find her way to New Mexico, where she built a home. She had a very personal vision that was at odds with the trailing trends of work in the time. And she followed this principle that I try to adhere to. I mean, how could you be Martin? But to only include what is necessary. She sort of worked through the principle of subtraction rather than or extraction rather than addition. And then that leads us naturally to the pencil. And this happens to be a Via Selman's replica of a pencil. It's about 8 feet long. It's a giant number 2 pencil. And to me, pencils are really fascinating. I mean, as architects, you may work with leads, or maybe you're totally in, what is it, SketchUp or AutoCAD or Revit or whatever it may be now. But the pencil is really essential to architects and also to artists. And I think to all of us, the number 2 pencil is this sort of ubiquitous tool that you expect to find in your kitchen drawer somewhere. You know you have one, you're not quite sure exactly where it is, but it's probably in that kitchen drawer, unless you use them intensively like I do. This is an image of my studio table. The drawings I make use hundreds of pencils. I have a couple sharpeners. I burn them out a lot. So for about 20 years or longer, I've been working, making drawings with lines in space and on 2-dimensional substrates. This is mat board. And this is an image of an early drawing. And actually the vertical line that's evident in this image is in the mat board. So, and there's a little kind of haze or sense of fuzz, which is also a reflection of the composition of the mat board. So that's a roller mark from the production of that mat board. So the pencil becomes almost like an X-ray of the structure of the mat board. So you can see there's a weaving language here that's embedded in the work. I actually don't know how to weave. I probably should learn at some point. But I became interested in the sort of record of time past and the building of a field, a place, a space. And in a way, it's diaristic in that it's reflecting the movement of my hand and the nature of the mat board. So this is an early drawing, very early drawing that shows how I began to realize if I changed the pressure of my hand, I could alter the tone of the lead. And obviously the lines on the far right are the 9H pencil. They become into 2, 3, 4B, and so on. So it's a systemic field of lines that almost becomes photographic, or maybe even refers to machines that record breathing and heart monitors, EKGs, wave pattern equipment, but yet it's clearly made by the hand. So the minute shifts of pressure and angle and even the sharpness of the pencil greatly affect the image. There's a lot I control, but a lot I can't control. So at some point, a couple of architects when I lived in Kansas City heard me say at an opening, I wish I could find a parallel bar that's longer than 60 inches, which is, you know, sort of the span of your arms, the typical bar on the table. And they hightailed it back to their metal shop and said, let's make Lindberg a 10-foot bar. So they set to work to dissect a parallel bar and build, in this case, a 10-foot bar that's on a 10 by 10 foot wooden drawing board. And I'm standing on a lift here because I need to get to the top of that drawing. But there's a video coming up in a little while. That board can raise and lower on an electric winch. So it's a pretty fantastic drawing tool. that was extremely awkward when I first got it because the bar is heavy and I had to figure out sort of how to hold the bar and make the line and walk and pay attention to what I was doing. It's this kind of multi-sensory experience that builds the drawing. But I'm one with it now. I understand it. I can alter it, and I've made these lifts to get me to the material. I flip the drawing around to draw all parts of it. So I'm drawing all of my drawings in a horizontal condition, but I find myself often tipping my head or taking a photograph because ultimately the drawing is vertical, which in this case it was. Um, so, Oops. So these are some of the drawings. These are as tall as I am, or not quite as tall as I am, but close to, they're taller than I am. They're obviously made horizontally, and I began to really think about the fact that sort of the pace of my step and my breath, the action of my hand, the pressure of my hand really does create the image. They're all the same length. The lines are in some sense the same, but the independence of how each line is made builds the image. So these are two images that sort of have a sense of breathing. They're almost like lung forms. And I began to sort of spill color into them, to layer a colored pencil layer over the top. And these are a couple that came a little later, where more pronounced graphic elements in the drawings began to create a different kind of sense of space and rhythm and foreground, background, and kind of the current of the drawing, and then the rhythmic structure of these colored lines. So in 2009, I was a resident at the OMI International Art Center, which is about half an hour north of T-Space, very near where I now live. I was living in Kansas City at the time, and I created a very experimental piece in the studios there, which is a barn on the property, that I pinned thread to the wall. I was making drawings, and then I thought, what would happen if I put these drawings in space? And so I was one of the few people with a car. I hightailed it up to Albany to a space where I could buy some thread and pins, and made a very, very crude experiment of what has now become a very integral part of my practice. So following that experience, a curator in the Kansas City area invited me to, like, he said, basically, like, let's try to make one big. I'll give you the space to do it. If it doesn't work out, we'll scrap it and someone else will put up work. But I would like to see you try to build this in a way where you can actually secure the threads to the wall and so on. So a lot of engineering and testing of different threads and staples and contact points and so on occurred. And this is the first project that I made where I pulled thousands of threads between two walls. This is 14 feet wide, 7 feet tall, and 7 feet deep. It's a little square space, a relatively small square space, and it's kind of a Rothko of sorts. It's really kind of an image of light. So we built the piece from the back of the space coming forward so we could keep ourselves out of the spider web. And I was at one wall, an assistant at the other, and someone was walking the thread back and forth. We sort of invented the process as we went. But what happened is something I could not have imagined, which has to do with sort of the optics of our eyes and the way we see light and contrast. It sort of gets at very, very core ideas of color theory. So when in the space, as with the person standing, the image on the left, the room feels very yellow when you first enter, especially because you're coming out of the cool light of the atrium of the museum into this small box that everyone called the yellow room. So the light is reflecting off the thread and turning the room yellow. But what was really, and you can see there, I'm blurry in the photograph about to enter. It looks like there's yellow light in the room. And in a way there is, but it's sort of a light fixture in the form of thread. It turns the space yellow and exaggerates the blue light, the daylight in the atrium. But what happened, which is sort of impossible to photograph, we only know through the physiology of the way we see color and contrast, is once you got in the room, slowly your eyes find equal, they find balance, and the walls then felt white after a few minutes. On first entering, it's bright yellow, and then of course when you're in the space and you look out at the blue atrium, it's really blue. So this kind of way in which the body and the way we see um, uh, creates meaning, creates transition. I mean, it's almost like there was an element of time in the work. So this got me pretty excited. um, so I'm going to read you a passage from a fascinating book called I Send You This Cadmium Red. It's an illustrated book of correspondence between through letters, written letters through the writer John Berger and the filmmaker artist John Christie about color. The book is no longer in print. I highly recommend you find it. And it relates to an exchange that the poet and I had leading up to the Archive Gallery T-Space exhibition. So bear with me while I read this. This is Berger writing to Christie. Is honey the living equivalent of gold? Supposing one tried to give temperatures to colors. In a sense, we do it all the time when talking about warm and cool ones. A certain red is 98 degrees Celsius. Ultramarine is 7. Cobalt blue is minus 10. Maybe yellow is the one color which is body temperature, 37 degrees Celsius. And so the ancient Egyptians believed it was the color of immortality. You are struck by the fact that yellow is never quite regular. It's varied. As you say, it stores and reflects light, but it recedes and gives off waves which are not constant, as though its surface is liquid rather than solid. It is, and this irregularity reminds us of living skin of a body. Whoops. So this piece is called Drawn Pink, as you saw. It's about 42 feet, and it was in a really compelling exhibition called Placemakers, which meant quite a bit to me, this idea. The Bemis Center, in case you don't know it, in Omaha, Nebraska, is one of the oldest art centers in the country. And it continues to be, it's a place that has residents for semesters at a time, I believe. It's in a massive old industrial building, and it's well known for its quite experimental programming. They have worked with an artist who built a living rainbow, like with water above the building, like fantastic, fantastic projects. So you can see the emanation of pink on the face of this person. So it wasn't quite as contained a space as the yellow piece, but it did kind of alter the sense of the color of the walls around it. And this sort of gets to this idea that it greets your body first and your analysis or intellect later, sort of great feeling of immersion. And another thing that's a part of these pieces is they happen, and because they're built into the architecture, they're stitched into the architecture in a sense, they do come down and they have to be cut. There's really not a way to save the material in any way I can use again. What has often happened is the material is cut and then donated to art schools in the area who do things with it. But this was a particularly beautiful cut down because of the way we cut it right at the wall. You can see, and there's this beautiful chatter of scraps of thread and staples on the wall, which I found really telling and compelling, is how the cut right at the wall as it fell to the floor sort of kept the straight line. It shows how taut the thread was. It's a reflection of it. It's, sprung and then relaxed position. So these are sort of what I would call falling drawings or fallen drawings. And here's some images of various situations we've been in. Harnesses with chains above 3-story atrium spaces, crazy situations. In the upper right, you can see we pulled the sheetrock off the wall once. The wall hadn't been built very well. It was 24 inches on center on a moist Midwest May morning on a Monday. I think the show opened on Friday. So we watched these 2 4-by-10-foot sheets crash to the floor. Pretty amazing. There was just so much tension. It was a 55-foot span of thread, which doesn't seem like a lot. And it was just a little bit of thread when you balled it all up. But the sort of principle of bridge building showed itself with thread that can pull sheetrock off the wall, which I found like, power to the people sort of idea. So we repaired it and opened the show with a piece that wasn't quite as heavy. I'll put it that way. We loosened the density of threads. So one thing you might see in the middle image on the left is a number graph system. We don't use this paper anymore. We diagram it a different way, but those numbers represent how many staples are in a given area. So it's a diagram between the 2 people who are stitching. So that's that. So in 2015, I moved to the Hudson Valley. And the great tradition of the Hudson River School has found its way into me. How can it not? The incredible amber light. And Thomas Cole's home in Catskill is a museum, a house museum, and also has had contemporary programming led by the curator Kate Menkenary, who I will be speaking with in the archive gallery later this fall. This was an exhibition about Cole's relationship to color called Spectrum. And I built this relatively small piece on the 2nd floor in the living and workspaces of the home. And you might notice we put up a panel to the wall because this is a historic structure. But the other thing to note is that this color is the color that the walls were in Cole's time, which seemed like a fantastic opportunity for me to work with complementary colors. So here you can see some staple patterns in the way in which the lavender periwinkle walls mixed with the yellow thread in front. This is Zaha Hadid's Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, which is a building without right angles, or very few right angles, as I understand. And this piece is called Cadence, and it's sort of an image of a skylight. That's not a skylight, but the shaft of space in that gallery goes up about 30 feet, I believe. And so I sort of created this image of daylight or image of light coming into the building. And the piece actually touched that rough concrete column, like passed by it and touched the blade edge of it. So it's a sort of delicate thread against this rough architecture. It was really a pretty compelling project to work on. And I'm showing some pieces in notable spaces of architecture. This is Pei's Everson Museum in Syracuse, New York, one of his first US projects. This is called Bloodlines. This exhibition was actually, the drawings that were part of the show were packed and ready to be picked up in April of 2020. And obviously they weren't picked up. The show was delayed until the fall of 21 due to COVID. And actually, I think I had a slightly different color in mind at first, but following the experience of COVID, I just had to make a blood red piece to speak to the moment. So it was a pretty interesting exhibition about the relationship between abstraction and fiber. And so you could get fully under it. On one end, it was a quite vertical gesture on the left side of this image that twisted and essentially became the same proportion, but a horizontal gesture on the right side. And these are some images of really close-up images of the staples, so you can see the way the things are made and then how it sat in Pei's incredible building. Really remarkable piece of architecture to get to work in. And here's a detail of being under the side that you could get fully under. The electric lights create this sort of spray of shadows that I think is almost like another layer of drawing. As are the little sort of jumper lines between the staples. So I tend to be the one who ties the thread. It goes to the other person, staple, staple, and comes back to me, staple, staple, and goes back. So the lines don't touch. They sort of lift and create a cloud of color without actually touching each other. So, oh, I was actually going to say, which I think is kind of important to speak about, red, the sort of emotional power of red, or the symbolic power of red. In many cultures, it's of course not just an image of blood, but sort of suggests the entire cycle of human life. And it also creates a wider wavelength than any other hue. And it's the only color that sort of remains saturated in our peripheral vision. So it has this kind of immersive and overwhelming experience for us. And that's often why it's used for signaling, like stop signs and various kinds of ways in which we communicate with one another. Anish Kapoor calls it an inside out color. So it speaks of and to the body at the same time. So then these are some somewhat recent, these are sort of late COVID pieces that I made that began to sort of use color as to signify caution or alarm or concern during the time we live in. And two larger drawings made also during the same time period in our lives. These apparitions or absences began to appear. These are both sort of body-like forms in a way, sort of ghostly, sunlit passages. Turn up your speaker if you need to. This is great.
Yeah, maybe. And do you think you could maybe reshare with audio? I don't know if it was coming through before.
Oh, what do I do? I'm sorry.
No, maybe just pause it and then
Okay. How do I do that?
I think just exit out of the presentation for a second and then
Oh,
stop and
stop.
reshare. I think there should just be a slider that maybe you can turn on.
A slider
Yeah, like a little switch.
in the Zoom interface?
When you click share, it should show up there.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I apologize for, oh, share sound. We went through this. I'm sorry.
No, no, no. It's
We
no
went-
problem at all.
Okay, so I'm going to start over because I apologize. There was a great Eno piece with the other one.
Yeah, perfect.
Sorry. So what I like particularly about that recording by Niels Fromm is the scratches in the recording that seem analogous to the scratches, if you will, in the drawing, because very often the drawing shows where I sort of wiggle a little bit or the pencil breaks or something happens in the process. So when you get close to the drawings, you can see the evidence of the making to the next nearest there. So then a project that's just sort of a precursor in a way to the project I'll do at the T-Space Archive Gallery is this. This is an image from a thread installation at the Figge Art Museum. The project is called Think Like the River, and it was a collaborative project with the poet Ginny Threefoot. It sort of is intertwined with climate events during this time and the pandemic. The museum is located right along the edge of the Mississippi River. And I grew up not far from this museum, and Ginny grew up in New Orleans, where the Mississippi exits into the Gulf. And in 2019, there were quite devastating floods across Iowa. And actually, water was lapping up against the museum. Hurricane Katrina also was an experience Ginny was a part of. So she had written this quite profound poem called Think Like the River, which was the conceptual impetus for the entire project. And it's really began a conversation between the two of us about the human's relationship to environment, and that if we were to think like the river, perhaps we would make different decisions. The river needs to flow, the banks of the river need to expand and contract. It needs to be supple and respond to climate conditions. So our bodily relationship and our physiology to this installation was a reflection of that. So the exhibition was delayed due to COVID and then delayed due to the floods. It was a really kind of crazy situation, but this is an image of a large scale 25-foot multi-panel drawing that I made. And you might note the colored bars in the drawing. Viewers were challenged to take a sort of serpentine path through the gallery. One thread form rose in one direction, the other rose in the opposite. So they were sort of zigzag to one another. And this is an image of the drawing and then the way in which her poetry existed on the wall. So you can see the poem in its entirety there is in kind of a pack to the right. And then the poem was exploded across the wall and separated and found its placement in relationship to the bars. So it was a kind of, the bars in the drawing, that is. So it was a kind of conversation between visual and literary language and how these things could mirror and reflect one another. It was a really, really rewarding project and is, as I said, has some similarities to the project I'll put up in about a month or so. So this project at the Textile Museum at George Washington University is called What Color is Divine Light? And it is actually a question in an essay that the curator shared with me about how painters have expressed conditions of light through history. And the wall, the lavender wall you're looking at, is slightly curved. Behind that column, there's a curve in the wall. So I painted the wall that color and then worked with primarily yellow thread against it. During this time, I became quite interested in a condition that's called impossible color or forbidden color, some people have called it, where our eyes, we think we see in colored light, we think we see the transition between complementary colors like yellow or purple and yellow, or yellow and blue, or green and red. We think we see these transitions. And intellectually, we can sort of imagine what that color might look like, but we actually don't see that transition. We actually see a sort of flash of white at the middle. So it's this kind of trick in a way. It's this impossibility of comprehending the relationship between two complementary colors. So I realized at some point when I'm making the drawings and the thread installations for that matter, that I often use the proximity of two complementary colors to create a kind of energy or electricity in, let's say, a drawing that's primarily yellow actually has quite a bit of blue in it in order to energize that yellow. And then this also brings about my interest in indigo dye, where the dye pot is actually sort of a mustard yellow color. And when you release the fabric into the air and it hits oxygen, it turns blue. So it's this kind of interest in complementary space. So this is a drawing that I made for that same exhibition, sort of expressing this idea that there's blue in the yellow part of the drawing and yellow in the blue part of the drawing, and also an apparition and so on. So it was a pretty extraordinary exhibition. And what was really rewarding about it, I think I have another image, is that the room became a space where a lot of programming happened. So the folks from Islamic faith in Washington, D.C. met to speak about experiences of intolerance in the city. Yoga classes happened, dance performances happened, music, education groups. The medical residents at George Washington University came and were taken through sort of like a sound bath experience on Friday mornings. Like, it was really amazing how this work created a space for all kinds of conversations about meaning and place and the human condition. So this is a studio gang, Jeannie Gang Museum in Arkansas. The Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts was reimagined as a contemporary space, and I was invited to make a piece in this transitional space between two galleries. It's called Passage, and this really is sort of a passage gallery. So it's two forms that split open in the middle. It's kind of a surprise that there's a gap in the middle. It's over your head as you pass. And this is another piece that really grabs the architecture, so to speak, or engages the architecture, called Impossible Red. It was in a pretty interesting exhibition at the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art. And it was an exhibition that looked at the relationship between mathematics and visual art. So this piece you could get inside of. The thread literally wrapped that column and returned to the wall on the other side and created a kind of room within the gallery space. It's a kind of a muscular piece that I found pretty compelling to build. And then I was invited somewhat recently to build an outdoor piece, which was a really rewarding experience. I built it south of here in Highland, New York. It was ultimately part of a photo essay for Upstate Diary. But on a very, very cold day in February of 2024, we built this piece, and it was up for just 2 weeks. We didn't leave it up too long due to the possibility of animals interacting with it. But many, many footsteps were made, and it was a pretty beautiful condition. I don't have a video of it, but as the ash trees moved in the wind, the thread sort of vibrated slightly. So it was a reflection of where it was located. It was really a rewarding experience to do. You can see how muddy it was one of the days we were working. And then this is the last exhibition project I'm going to share before looking at the archive gallery. This is a show I did in Chicago in a gallery called Seacrest Beach. And I'm just going to read a short passage from William Gass's book called On Being Blue. Of all colors, blue and green have the greatest emotional range. Blue is therefore most suitable as the color of interior life. Whether slick, light, sharp, high, bright, thin, quick, sour, new or cool, or low, deep, sweet, dark, soft, slow, smooth, heavy, old, and warm, blue moves easily among them all, and all profoundly qualify our states of feeling. So again, a thread installation, I put a gap at eye level to sort of bring the body into conversation. It's just like a 2-inch gap at my eye level, at least. And it was, there's a detail of how that happened, just sort of two forms stacked on each other. And there were a whole series of drawings and conversation with the work. And these are some fairly recent drawings showing the way the apparitions are now mixing with color, and some quite new pieces made in response to the fog in the wetland adjacent to my studio. We didn't realize before moving here how much fog would be a part of our lives. And nearly every morning it's foggy in some form. And it's kind of incredible. You can take a sip of your coffee and then look up again and it's gone. It's this kind of fleeting condition that seems to feed into drawings. So this is the archive gallery at T-Space. These are some renderings made by my friend Elvis Acapul, who actually worked on Stephen's Nelson project in Kansas City. He's far beyond his pay grade with these renderings now, but he still faithfully helps me generate these images, which I think we did a pretty good job of. So there will be two thread forms that respond to the skylights on the right side of the gallery in this image, and then sort of come together and land to basically create a slightly narrow space next to what I call the telephone booth, the little pop out of windows in the gallery. And I'm working with the poet H.L. Hicks, who is a longtime colleague of mine. And I'm going to refer back to the Berger and Christie quotation I read to you about the color yellow. Not unlike Berger and Christie, Harvey is H.L. H.L.'s name is Harvey. Harvey and I began an email conversation that lasted for 30 days. And he would send me a quotation from art history or poetry or his own writing. And I was to respond as instinctively and without analysis as possible, and send something back to him. I could send him an image, a description of what I was looking at, and something that made me think of. And this dialogue back and forth, which again happened for 30 days, generated over 230 syllable lines of poetry that he wrote. And it was wide ranging. It was everywhere from ideas of luminism, which is an offshoot of the Hudson River School, to hanging out the laundry, to books I was reading, to quotations from other artists and images of artists that he didn't know about. It was he quoted the Bible at one point. Like, it was a really fruitful and interesting dialogue that we had. So I have worked with a laser cutter and selected a script font, and the poetry it has been cut into plexiglass, and it will be pinned to the wall gently. And it can't really be rendered in the renderings accurately, but the plexiglass script, I'll call it, or poetry script, feels like glass. It feels like crystal almost, the way it catches. It's, like the way a gemstone responds to light. All of the facets of the letters catch the light. And we're pretty excited about it. So that's what I have. And I will stop the share. And I'm happy to have a conversation in whatever form seems right. And we can jump back to images if that is helpful.
Thank you so much, Anne, for sharing, for all your insights into your process. I cannot shake it up how physical it is and how virtual it feels at the same time. It's unreal. I would love to open up for questions from our residents. Thank you.
I have kind of an open-ended question, Anne.
Yeah, love it.
I keep kind of coming back to like the single line, especially within your first slide. And I'm kind of curious to hear a little bit about what you think the gesture of the line means, or how because it is so simple, but yet in like an installation like yours, there's so much reverberation and like great, that's just such an emotional experience I was having, like looking at the work, and I'm just very curious to hear like what your thoughts on a single line are.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many thoughts. Something that's always been kind of in my mind and I sort of forgot to articulate in words is that drawing to me is like travel. Making a line. I mean, there's the famous walk the line, but this kind of idea that a line begins somewhere and goes somewhere. And in my case, I'm actually walking while I'm casting or marking or creating that line, whether I'm drawing. I mean, I do make smaller drawings, but on the big drawings. So this kind of idea that it's an arc of time and an arc of space. And the lines in the thread installations, you could say, are individual lines. They have contact points and it's continuous, but you feel the individuality of it. in the collective of all the lines.
Mhm.
The same is that's the same case in the drawings. I don't run them to the edge of the paper on purpose so that you feel like you could lift it.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not speaking very poetically, I suppose, but this kind of notion of travel, and it's travel of the body and travel in the mind, um, and its relationship to language and handwriting is, um, I think, is what has led me to be interested to work with poets. Um, Harvey spoke a lot about the 30 syllable line of text or thread of text. He's found himself using the word line and thread and stanza and the sort of languages of poetry in sort of physical terms, which has been really a fruitful experience. But to speak a typical line of poetry that's 10 or 12 syllables, you can say it in one breath, a la Shakespeare or Rumi or someone. Um, but a 30 syllable line, you can't say in one breath. So you feel the breath of the reader, and you almost feel the breath in as you are reading it or the person speaking it. So that kind of the pace of my step in relationship with the making of lines. Yeah, my mind is wandering, but lines can be sprung,
Mhm.
they can be taught, they can have physicality, they can pull sheetrock off the wall. You know, they they're they're measured, but yet um a lot can happen along the way. Um, yeah,
Definitely.
yeah.
Yeah. I was just thinking about like the line holding tension, right? And then there's the relaxing point. And I kind of thought that you might be interested in knowing what Neil's from, who I'm also really inspired by. What you're hearing in the audio is he's placed mics,
Yeah,
right? So
right.
those scratching is just like every key being pressed is you hear that body movement, even if it's mechanical, which I think is just like such a strong connection in terms of your drawings of, just kind of your breath or your touch. And so it's very
Yeah.
linked. Yeah.
I did an exhibition at Artomai, which I didn't share, that resulted in a performance by Denman Morani, a piano, like a hyper pianist, he calls himself, where he's inserting objects into the strings as he plays. And it was a
Mhm.
riveting,
Wow.
riveting performance he gave with a beautiful big grand piano. Yeah, the microphone inside the instrument, animating all of the physics essentially of the strings of the instrument. Yeah, super powerful. Mhm.
Hi,
Small
Anne.
detail. Sorry to write, just to one small detail. I noticed in the video where you were drawing and where you have a tiny little arrow pointing to the right and then a little pointing to the left. I was like, is there direction? In what way?
It was the top of the drawing to
It
remind
points.
myself what was the top.
Oh, wow. Okay, so there's.
Yeah, there's a cleat on the back of the panel. So in some cases, I have the fabricator of the panel make it so I can hang it any way I want, but that particular panel had a direction, so I had to sort of keep the cardinal north in mind. Yeah, so the arrow was just reminding me of what the top of the drawing was. Yeah.
The panel has direction, the lines don't, right? But the panel has.
Yeah, which is sort of an interesting way to think about, like, the drawing can be, I'm making it from all sides, but it ultimately has a posture. And in that particular case, the lines were vertical. And to get to Jackie's question about lines, I mean, lines that are vertical or lines that are horizontal are so different. One that's vertical, it's standing, it's got energy, it could walk, it's, you know, it's standing. And one that's horizontal is inherently resting. Yeah.
Yeah,
It
I
may
had the same
suggest
question.
different. I think a horizontal line suggests span or distance or dimension more than a vertical line, at least in my view.
I had the same intuition as or like question as Irene, where it's interesting how you're kind of flipping the panels that you're working on while you're drawing. And in your drawings or two-dimensional work, I guess, it seems like all the lines have one direction, but in your installation works, it seems like you can kind of move around in the direction switches. So I guess I was curious and kind of in tandem with Jackie's question about line, um, how direction plays in your work and like how you like maybe like in spaces how you coordinate the direction of how the installation will move in the space.
Yeah, it's such a good question. Um, you're invited to do a project, and the first thing I ask for is all the architectural drawings of it that exist, and Elvis and I build them if they don't exist, which was really fun to do with the pay drawings because we had reproductions of the actual hand drawings, and we built a CAD file of that, which was really a thrill for him as an architect. But yeah, then obviously you all work in this kind of environment. I have to watch someone else do it, but just to sort of um, start thinking about wayfinding, like where do you enter? I mean, maybe a more global question is like, what is this space? Who is its audience? Where is it? What is its programming like? What history does it have? Obviously, what the conceptual premise of the curator may be for the project. Um, and all of those kinds of more situational conceptual questions are floating in my mind. And then once the form of the space is built in the computer, then I also build small lots of them for every project, little foam core models. They're just 1 inch to or they're 1/4 inch to 1 foot scale. Um, and I stitch them, just they're crude and so on, but they really help me like understand what the thread installation is as a form. And so when Elvis and I begin working, it's a chunk. It doesn't have lines in it yet. It's like a thing. It's a shape, some sort of geometric shape. Um, and we lift it and twist it and shift it around. He can take the form and torque it and make it wider and narrower. And then I'm also thinking about logistics, like where is the scaffold and where am I going to be when I'm making it and so on. So um, I guess to answer your question is like sometimes I'm interested in a form sort of presenting its entirety to you as you enter the space. So it sort of opens up. Its arm span, its wingspan is evident. And in other situations, due to the programming or the nature of the project, the sort of hide and seek of it in the architecture becomes an interesting element. Um, and I think that has to do with direction. Um, whether it's facing you like a drawing or whether it's coming to you transversely, that can create, like you then engage with it in a different way because your body's coming to it in a different way. I don't know if that gets at what you're thinking about.
Yeah, I think it does, and I thought your piece, I forget the title of the piece, but the one that was like almost pulling the column, I thought that was interesting and how, because when I do sketches, I also kind of see lines as connection points, but also have the ability to create like a kind of distortion or separation. Um, and it's interesting how you're using these installations, some of them as fields, but others as like a kind of like a gesture or motion. Um, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I would just say that piece is one of the main ones that, I mean, these are weird labels that Jackie can relate to, but like, is it drawing or is it sculpture? It doesn't really
Mhm.
matter. But that one was really sculptural. Like it
Mhm.
very much was a thing that was taking a gesture. It had an action. It touched the architecture. It had, verbs. It grabbed. It encircled. It had um, like definitive things that it was doing, whereas many of the other ones are sort of in a more indeterminate space. They're floating, they're hovering, did they just appear and they're going to disappear shortly, like this sort of misty, foggy quality that the thread can have. So that's why I made that red, like yeah. It took a turn, it decided to turn around. It had a mind. Yeah. Mhm.
I
I'm
got a
really,
question as well.
sorry.
Go
Uh,
ahead, David.
yeah, I'm really fascinated by the one that's called the Divine Light that has the purple background versus um, more reading like a translucent cloud that kind of has that transparency built in, so that like when you read the cloud versus the background, you see that in there, like in between spaces, kind of as an interpretation of how, like when you're talking about the counter colors, how you can read that in between, and especially with the lightness of the threads, you don't read the shadows anymore, so you really see that as a color mesh versus any of actual bodies. That really touches
Yeah.
me really deeply.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I realized as we were building it, it had a pretty long span. I was on the right side looking at it transversely, and two people were doing the passing of the thread, and Caroline kept saying, "Come to the middle, you got to see what's happening," because what I was seeing was something totally different than what she was seeing, because the lavender through the threads, as you say, was an extremely active part of it. And one thing that happened in terms of the sort of building of the color, because you build it from the back coming forward, is we'd put in a layer of color and then we'd smoke it with white, and then we'd put in a layer of color and then fade it. So it's almost like it kept wanting to be definitive in its color, but I wanted it to be this indeterminate, sort of very spiritual, uh, ghosty kind of form. So that required the color kind of to keep pushing the color back. But there's another work where you let the color go, just not that one.
And I think the curvings of that wall at the back is really helping, because you don't read that seams in the middle anymore. You read it as a continuous surface.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I didn't show the photograph, but you could get under it. And I had some friends come visit, and somebody scooted under there and stood up. You couldn't see them actually.
Oh,
It was very interesting. Very interesting.
peculiar angles.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I would like to ask, so what I see a lot is that mainly when you draw, or actually I don't think there is one, the lines are always parallel, right? Always. Like let's say in the spaces that are not drawings, but for me they even are drawings within the space, although they're not drawn.
Sure.
But did you, and perhaps an add-on to the question, like the movement in space within a specific perspective onto the spatial ones with the threads in the angle, when you had them installed in the angles of the space itself, they got even more three-dimensional for me. Like this, I don't know, they had even a curvy shape to be underneath. Depends how close or far you get off them. I think I never saw them in reality, but I think that's what I would feel even more being live. So do you have, so what does parallelity in the mass of the lines, like, do you see your works as every single line tells something, or does the whole mass explain to you, or you get the atmosphere?
I mean, I think the answer in my most quiet thoughts are that every line is what it's about. Like each individual line is what it's really about. But I can't deny that when they come together. It's the orchestration. So, yeah, I don't know why I quite say it that way, but each line as it's made in the drawing is a choice, a color. It sits independently from the one below it or above it. And I'm watching how close or far it gets from the one below it because you can tip that pencil on the bar and like change its position. So, I mean, I'm not like wowed by it or anything, but that's the language. Like that's what it's about is the proximity to each other. So the line is the vehicle to charge that negative space, as Simon said. Like, um, uh, yeah, and it's sort of the case with the installations in space as well, because the staples change their proximity to each other. So the denser they get, the more saturated the color becomes because it's collecting together in space. And so in that case, I'm using the negative space to change the density of color, or the concentration of the color. Yeah, so I guess it's both. I don't know that that's the kind of answer one.
No, I think it's just really
I wish
beautiful.
I could be more definitive, but it's,
No,
it's also like
okay.
walking on a sidewalk in New York City. They're like, I want to make sure I don't fall, but I'm also like in the wave with everyone else and trying to find my way to the next crossing, street crossing. Yeah.
It's beautiful that you can read them as a drawing in space, but as well in a three-dimensional way. And that I think it's beautiful that it can offer both.
Yeah. I do want to say something that would mean something to architects if you've worked with a parallel bar is that you're probably taught in school to spin the pencil as you draw to keep it sharp. And I do that, but I also distinctively don't spin it to make sure it does get unsharp because it changes the nature of the line and closes the space between them. So yeah, that becomes this kind of, again, the gesture of the hand and so on. Yeah.
Hi, my question is actually about when you're programming a work, when you choose the certain type of colors, you rely more on the meaning that these colors already have, where you try to like create another meaning for the colors that you choose, like creating like another types of sensations and behaviors.
Well, it's interesting because definitely colors carry meaning, but any one color of the thread I choose needs all the others to create that meaning. So by using analogous or complementary colors, you can twist the tone of it, like a blood red as opposed to a wine red, these kinds of distinctions. Um, but there have been times, again, I'm sorry I didn't show certain projects that would benefit from your questions. Your questions have touched important things. I did a project at the Museum of Art and Design in New York where I said to myself, I'm going to try to make a piece where someone can't name the color. Like they're not going to walk away and say that was red or that was yellow or whatever. And what ended up happening was, for lack of a better way to describe it, it became a kind of like a pearl, where depending upon where you were in relationship to the daylight and the electric light and the proximity to the work, it danced between yellow, green, blue, pink, like it had a kind of kaleidoscope of its personality changed, which yeah, it turned out a little pretty, but on the other hand, it was kind of got to what you're asking, like the color was in a sense situational. Yeah, and not fixed.
Yeah, I thought talking about color, the choice of color in your outdoor installation was um particularly I guess surprising or like captivating because it
Mhm.
was such contrast in or in contrast with with its environment. And in the kind of context of resonance and how we're working in the residency, I thought it was interesting. There's a quote that I've been leaning on for my practice this past month, and it's I think if I'm quoting it correctly, it's what seems still is actually moving.
Mm.
And I felt that through that particularly piece in your work.
Yeah, thank you. Uh the site was bordered by a beautiful old stone wall. It had been a pasture for cattle probably and had trees that it no longer holds cattle. It's like a 1720s stone house, really incredible site. So it had this kind of collected sense of place and a lot of history. And history of the animals and those who tended the animals, but um, the tree canopy was quite far from the ground because the ash they take on water easily. It was a little bit of a wetland kind of situation, so they take on water and they had grown quite tall, so the canopy was way, way what felt like really in the sky. You didn't feel the tree canopy in your body space. So it was like these swaying poles. And the light condition was pretty dramatic. There's a big hill to the kind of beyond where those camera views were. The house was behind us in those camera views. So it had this kind of sense of green dome over it, although it was winter, so there was no green, I guess. But the sense of the tree canopy was almost tent-like. So yeah, I knew that it might snow, and I knew the surrounding color was quite muted because it was February in New York State. So to sort of bring in that was mason line, which is used to, strike an even line when laying brick. It seemed sort of like the right material for the moment. It's a little stretchy and sort of fluorescent usually, so it's easily seen for those laying stone or it was sort of nice to use that material. So it was white, fluorescent yellow, fluorescent green, and caught the light in a way that I thought was provocative.
Is there a new material or site context you would like to work on next?
A new material. Well, the plexiglass poetry has me pretty excited. And I'd like to figure out a way to do it with glass. And I've worked with glass before. I'm actually about to install a large glass project at an airport where I've basically made a drawing that's translated into a printable image inside glass, inside the sandwich of glass. So to see this poetry on my studio table downstairs, listening on the table, it's really exciting. So I can see some things will come from the T-Space project for sure.
I'm truly excited to see the show, and thank you so much for your time. Unless there is
Absolutely.
any final comments, just a big, big thank you for all your insights. Lens are so very fundamental to architects and our discussion. It's so rich, bringing in poetry, architecture, space-time physics. It's beautiful. Thank you, truly.
Yeah, and if you're in the Valley during Labor Day, please come because Harvey will read some of that poetry as well as some other things from his work. He's a delightful, extraordinarily brilliant man. Yeah. Thank you
Looking
all.
forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erin.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.